I knew something was wrong the moment I heard the laughter coming from the backyard. It wasn't the kind of laugh Emma usually gave, a quick giggle or a hearty chuckle. No, this was different. It was soft, intimate, the kind of laugh that wasn't meant for me to hear. It was late, too late for anyone to be outside. I'd come home from a work trip earlier than expected, letting myself in quietly so I wouldn't wake the kids. The house was dark except for the faint glow spilling out from the sliding glass doors at the back. I set my suitcase down and moved closer. That's when I saw them, Emma and a man I didn't recognize. They were sitting on the patio, leaning close, her hand resting on his knee. She was in her robe, the one I'd given her for Christmas last year, her hair loose and wild like she'd just rolled out of bed. The man was saying something I couldn't make out, but Emma laughed again, tilting her head back, her face lit with a glow I hadn't seen in years. My stomach dropped. I froze, rooted to the spot, trying to process what I was seeing. It wasn't the kind of scene you misinterpret. The way they sat, their body language, it spoke louder than words. I thought about walking out there, confronting them on the spot, but something stopped me. Call it shock, or maybe a twisted need to gather myself before I shattered. Instead, I stepped back into the shadows and circled around the house to the side gate. It creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and the man bolted upright, his eyes darting toward the noise. Emma turned too, her face draining of color when she saw me. "Dan," she stammered, pulling her robe tighter around herself. "You're home early." The man stood awkwardly, his hands shoved into his pockets like a teenager caught sneaking out. "Who the hell is this?" I asked, keeping my voice steady even though I felt anything but. Emma hesitated, glancing at him like she was hoping he'd answer for her. When he didn't, she blurted, "This is Tom. He's just a friend." "Just a friend," I repeated, stepping closer. "And this is how you treat your friends? Late-night drinks in your bathrobe?" "Dan, it's not what it looks like," she insisted, her voice trembling now. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The man, Tom, apparently cleared his throat and said, "Look, I think I should go." I laughed bitterly. "Yeah, you think?" He brushed past me, mumbling something about being sorry, but I didn't care. My focus was on Emma now. "Start talking," I said, my voice cold. And that's when she broke down, tears streaming down her face as she whispered the words that would change everything. I stood there in the kitchen, watching her unravel. Emma was still clutching the lapels of her robe like it was armor, tears pooling in her eyes as she stammered through excuses that barely made sense. I swear, it's not what you think," she started, her voice shaky but trying to sound convincing. "Tom is just a friend from work. He came over to talk about." I cut her off, stepping closer. "Don't insult me, Emma. I don't need a story. I need the truth. What was he doing here? Why were you out there with him at this hour, dressed like that?" Her eyes darted around the room like she was searching for an escape, her breathing uneven. "It's complicated," she finally said, barely above a whisper. "Complicated," I repeated, the word tasting bitter as it left my mouth. "That's all you've got? After what I just walked into? It's complicated? Try again." She broke then, her shoulders sagging as she collapsed into one of the kitchen chairs. She buried her face in her hands and stayed silent for what felt like an eternity. "Emma," I pressed, my voice harsher than I intended. "I'm not leaving this room until you tell me what's going on. All of it." When she finally looked up, her eyes were bloodshot and wet, her face a portrait of guilt. It started a few months ago," she began haltingly. "It was just coffee at first, after work. Talking about projects, venting about stress. But then it became something more. The air in the room seemed to thicken, and I felt like I couldn't breathe." "Something more," I echoed, trying to keep my voice steady. "What does that mean? Spell it out for me, Emma." She flinched at the edge in my voice but didn't look away. "We kissed," she admitted, her voice trembling. "It happened one night after a late meeting. I didn't mean for it to, but it happened. And it didn't stop there. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. My chest tightened, and I leaned against the counter to steady myself. How far has it gone? I asked, my words clipped, each one landing like a blow. Emma hesitated, and I could see the war playing out on her face, whether to soften the truth or rip the bandage off. "We've slept together," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "Twice." A wave of anger surged through me, hot and blinding. My fists clenched at my sides as I fought the urge to lash out, to scream, to throw something. Instead, I gritted my teeth and forced myself to stay in control. "When?" She hesitated again, wiping at her eyes like she was trying to buy time. "The first time was about a month ago," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The second was last week." Last week. While I was out of town for work, busting my ass to make sure our family had everything it needed, she was here with him, betraying everything we'd built. I stared at her, struggling to reconcile the woman in front of me with the Emma I thought I knew. "Why?" I demanded. "Why would you do this? What could possibly make you think this was okay?" Her lips trembled as she tried to form a response. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice cracking. "I was lonely, Dan. You've been gone so much for work, and when you're here, it's like you're not really here. We barely talk anymore. I felt invisible." I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and unfamiliar even to me. "Invisible? Emma, I've been breaking my back trying to provide for this family, to make sure you and the kids have everything you need. And you did it?" "It wasn't like that," she protested, her voice rising. "I didn't plan for this to happen, Dan. It just did." I shook my head, disgusted. "Things like this don't just happen, Emma. You don't accidentally end up in bed with someone. You made a choice, a series of choices, and every single one of them was a betrayal." Tears streamed down her face as she shook her head. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know I screwed up, but I never wanted to hurt you." I slammed my hand against the counter, the sound echoing in the silence. "Well, congratulations, Emma. You did. You destroyed everything. Was it worth it? Was he worth it?" She didn't answer, just stared at me with those tear-filled eyes, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I didn't know the woman in front of me. I pushed away from the counter and grabbed my keys. "I need to get out of here," I said, my voice cold and detached. "Dan, wait," she pleaded, standing up. "Please, don't leave. We need to talk about this." "There's nothing to talk about," I shot back. "You made your choices, Emma. Now I need to figure out what the hell I'm going to do with mine." I didn't wait for her to respond. I walked out the door, slamming it behind me, the sound reverberating through the quiet night. I drove aimlessly for hours, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts and emotions. Anger, betrayal, heartbreak, they all swirled together in a toxic mix that threatened to consume me. How had it come to this? How had the life I thought I knew turned into a nightmare in the span of a single evening? I didn't have the answers, but one thing was clear, everything had changed, and there was no going back. When I came back the next morning, the house was silent. Emma must have heard me pull into the driveway because she was already in the kitchen when I walked in. She looked terrible, hair unkempt, eyes swollen from crying, her robe still clinging to her shoulders like she hadn't moved from the spot where I left her. We didn't exchange a word at first. I grabbed a glass of water, took a long drink, and then leaned against the counter, facing her. "We're going to talk," I said, my voice firm but calm. "No more excuses. No more bullshit. You're going to tell me everything, and I mean everything. Do you understand?" Emma nodded, her eyes locked on the floor. "Okay," she whispered. "Good. Let's start with this. Who the hell is he?" "Tom," she said softly. "Tom Fisher. He works in accounting at my firm." I scoffed, shaking my head. "Accounting. Great. What's his story? Married? Kids?" "No," she answered. "He's divorced. No kids." "Of course," I muttered. "And how long has this been going on, really? Don't sugarcoat it." Her hands twisted nervously in her lap. It started a few months ago, she said. We'd talk during breaks, grab coffee after meetings. I didn't think anything of it at first. He was just easy to talk to. Easy to talk to, I repeated, the words leaving a bitter taste in my mouth. And I wasn't? Her head snapped up, her face crumpling. That's not what I meant. Dan, you've been gone so much lately. I've felt. I don't know. I guess I felt disconnected. Disconnected, I said, the word heavy in the air. And instead of coming to me, your husband, the father of your children, you went to him. What exactly did he offer you that I didn't? Emma flinched at the question, her hands shaking. It wasn't like that, she said, her voice trembling. It wasn't about you not being enough. It was about me feeling lost. Like I wasn't myself anymore. So he helped you find yourself by getting into your pants? I snapped. Her face crumpled as fresh tears fell, but I wasn't in the mood for pity. Not yet. When did it first happen? I demanded. She hesitated, her breath hitching. The night of the sales conference, she admitted. I told you it was running late, but, after the meeting, he invited me to his hotel room. I didn't plan for it to happen, Dan. I swear. I couldn't stop myself. I let out a hollow laugh. Couldn't stop yourself. That's rich. And the second time? Let me guess, you accidentally ended up in his bed again? Her cheeks flushed with shame. It was at his apartment, she said quietly. We were working late on a project, and one thing led to another, I finished for her, my voice dripping with sarcasm. She nodded, unable to meet my eyes. I paced the kitchen, trying to process everything she was telling me. The anger in me was boiling over, but I needed to stay in control. I wasn't going to let this devolve into shouting and tears, not yet, anyway. And the kids? I asked, my voice sharp. Where were they while you were busy with your projects? At home, she said quickly. I always made sure they were taken care of before, she trailed off, realizing how pathetic she sounded. Spare me the noble mother routine, Emma, I snapped. You think that makes it better? You think saying, I made sure the kids were okay first, somehow justifies what you did? She shook her head, her tears flowing freely now. No, she whispered. It doesn't justify it. Nothing does. I know that. Do you? I countered, leaning closer. Because it sure as hell doesn't seem like you thought about what this would do to me, or to them. Did you even care? Or were you too busy enjoying yourself to give a damn? Emma sobbed openly, her face buried in her hands. I didn't move to comfort her. I couldn't. Do you love him? I asked, the question cutting through the air like a blade. She froze, her shoulders tensing. Slowly, she looked up at me, her face pale. No, she said firmly. I don't. It wasn't about love. It was a mistake. A terrible mistake. Twice is not a mistake, Emma, I said coldly. Twice is a pattern. Her lip quivered, but she didn't argue. She couldn't. What now? She asked finally, her voice small and broken. What do we do now? I stared at her, the woman I'd loved for 15 years, and felt nothing but emptiness. I don't know, I said honestly. But things are going to change. Starting now. What do you mean? She asked, fear flickering in her eyes. You'll see, I said, grabbing my keys again. Stay here. Don't go anywhere. And don't bring him anywhere near this house, or so help me, Emma. I didn't finish the sentence. I didn't need to. She understood. Without another word, I walked out the door. When I left that house, my mind was already spinning with possibilities. I wasn't a violent man, but the urge to smash something, anything, was nearly overwhelming. I forced myself to stay focused, to channel my anger into something more productive. Emma thought she had played me for a fool, but I wasn't going to let her walk away from this unscathed. The first thing I did was park my car at a nearby diner, pull out my phone, and start taking notes. If I was going to confront this head-on, I needed to be smart about it. No impulsive decisions, no reckless actions. I needed a plan. The first part of that plan? Information. I knew Tom's name and where he worked, thanks to Emma's tearful confession. That was enough to start. I searched him online, digging through social media profiles and company pages. It didn't take long to find his LinkedIn, complete with his title, photo, and work history. Tom Fisher, mid-30s, divorced, no kids, just like Emma said. His profile was polished, professional, exactly the kind of guy who would charm his way into a woman's trust. I scrolled through his connections, noting mutual colleagues, and then opened Facebook. His account wasn't private, and it took me less than 5 minutes to find photos of him at company events, grinning with Emma in the background. Seeing those pictures made my blood boil, but I forced myself to stay calm. I took screenshots of everything: pictures, posts, comments. Evidence. If I was going to destroy him, I needed to be meticulous. The next day, I called in sick to work. I wasn't sick, of course, but I needed the time to put my plan into motion. I started by visiting a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but the best family attorney in town. I walked into his office with a folder full of notes and explained the situation. I want to protect my assets, I told him. My house, my savings, everything. And I want to make sure this affair doesn't screw me over in court. The lawyer nodded, his expression professional but sympathetic. We'll start by gathering evidence, he said. If you have proof of the affair, we can use that to negotiate a more favorable settlement. It won't guarantee anything, but it's a strong starting point. I handed him the screenshots I'd taken, along with a detailed timeline of Emma's behavior leading up to the affair. He glanced through them, nodding approvingly. This is good, he said. Keep documenting everything. Texts, emails, anything you can find. The more evidence we have, the better. From there, I moved on to the next phase of my plan, exposing Tom. I wasn't going to let him skate by without consequences. I started by sending anonymous messages to his HR department, complete with photos of him and Emma at company events. I didn't include any incriminating evidence yet. I wanted to see how far they'd dig on their own. Then, I created a burner email account and sent a message to Tom directly. The email was short and to the point. I know what you've been doing with Emma. Stay away from her, or this gets ugly. I didn't sign it, didn't give any details, but I knew it would rattle him. Men like Tom didn't expect consequences. They thought they could waltz into someone else's life, wreak havoc, and walk away unscathed. I was going to show him how wrong he was. Over the next few days, I stayed quiet, watching and waiting. Emma tried to talk to me several times, but I refused to engage. I slept in the guest room, kept my conversations with her to a minimum, and spent most of my time out of the house. She didn't press too hard. She was clearly terrified of what I might do, and that fear gave me the upper hand. A week later, my efforts started to pay off. I got a call from my lawyer, who had uncovered even more dirt on Tom. It turned out he had a history of workplace relationships, some of which had ended in messy disputes. The information wasn't public, but my lawyer had contacts who were willing to dig deep. Do you want to use this? He asked. We could anonymously tip off the media or his company. It won't directly help your case, but it could hurt his reputation. Do it, I said without hesitation. I want him to know what it feels like to have his life torn apart. The next step was confronting Emma again, but this time, I wasn't going to let her control the narrative. I sat her down at the kitchen table, my lawyer on speakerphone. We're going to discuss the terms of our separation, I told her, my tone icy. I've already started the process of filing for divorce. Her face crumbled, but I didn't let her interrupt. You'll get your fair share, I continued. But don't think for a second that you're walking away with everything. I've documented the affair, and if you try to push for more than you deserve, I'll make sure the judge sees every piece of evidence I have. She stared at me, her eyes wide with shock. Dan, please, she begged. I don't want a divorce. I made a mistake, but I want to fix this. For us, for the kids. This isn't about the kids, I interrupted. It's about you and your choices. You made this mess, Emma. Now you have to deal with the consequences. She started to cry, but I didn't care. I was done being the nice guy, done playing the fool. I laid out my terms, made it clear that I wasn't going to tolerate any more lies or manipulations, and then walked out of the room without waiting for her response. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about taking control of my life, about making sure no one ever treated me like a doormat again. Emma and Tom had made their choices, and now they were going to pay the price. 2 weeks had passed since I'd filed for divorce. Emma had tried every tactic in the book: apologies, tears, anger, bargaining. None of it made a dent. I was resolute. The house felt heavier now, filled with the suffocating weight of her guilt and my growing resentment. We moved around each other like strangers, each interaction transactional, every word between us cutting the air like glass. I'd been staying in the guest room, and though it was only a few feet down the hall, it might as well have been another world. I avoided her as much as possible, spending time with Jason and Lily to shield them from the tension. They didn't know the full story yet, but kids are sharper than we give them credit for. Jason had started asking pointed questions about why I wasn't sleeping in the same bed as their mother. "Dad, did you and Mom have a fight?" he asked one night while I helped him with his science project. I paused, not wanting to lie but not ready to open that Pandora's box. "Something like that," I admitted. "But we'll talk about it soon, I promise." I hated how vague it sounded, but I needed to time it right. I wanted to tell them together, to make sure Emma didn't spin it in her favor. That moment came sooner than I expected. It was a Saturday morning. The kids were in the living room watching cartoons, and Emma was sitting at the kitchen table, clutching a cup of coffee like it was her lifeline. I walked in, grabbed a mug for myself, and leaned against the counter. "We need to talk," I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. She looked up at me, her face pale. "About what?" "The kids," I said. "It's time we tell them." She stared at me, her lips trembling. "Dan, no. Not yet. They're too young." "They're not stupid, Emma," I interrupted. "They know something's wrong. Jason's already asking questions. We can't keep them in the dark forever." But can't we try to work this out first?" she pleaded. "For their sake?" I shook my head, my jaw tightening. "This isn't about saving the marriage anymore. It's about being honest with them. They deserve that much." Her shoulders slumped, and for once, she didn't argue. "Fine," she said quietly. "When?" "Now," I said firmly. No more stalling. We called Jason and Lily into the dining room, where Emma and I sat across from each other. The kids sat side by side, their innocent faces a stark contrast to the storm brewing in the room. "What's going on?" Jason asked, his voice laced with concern. Emma started to speak, but I held up a hand to stop her. "I'll go first," I said. "Your mom and I have been having some problems," I began, keeping my voice steady. "We've decided that it's best for us to separate." Jason's eyes widened, and Lily looked between us, her bottom lip trembling. "Separate? You mean, you're getting divorced?" Jason asked. "Yes," I said, nodding. "Why?" Lily asked, her voice small. I glanced at Emma, silently daring her to speak up. When she didn't, I continued. "Sometimes, adults make mistakes. And those mistakes make it hard for them to stay together. It's not because of anything you did. This is between your mom and me." Lily started to cry, and Emma reached for her, but Lily pulled away, burying her face in her hands. Jason, however, sat rigidly in his chair, his jaw clenched. "What kind of mistake?" he asked, his voice sharp. Emma opened her mouth, but I spoke first. "That's not something you need to worry about," I said. "What matters is that we both love you very much. That will never change." Jason's eyes narrowed. So you're not going to tell us the truth? Jason, Emma said, her voice trembling. Please, don't. Don't what? He snapped, standing up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. Pretend everything's fine? Pretend you didn't do something to screw this all up? Jason, that's enough, I said firmly. He glared at me, his eyes filled with tears. Whatever, Dad, he muttered before storming out of the room. Lily followed him, her small sobs echoing down the hall. Emma and I sat in silence, the weight of their pain pressing down on us. This is why I wanted to wait, Emma whispered, tears streaming down her face. They're not ready for this. No one's ever ready for this, Emma, I said coldly. But it's better than lying to them. Her tears fell harder, but I didn't offer her comfort. I couldn't. That night, after the kids had gone to bed, Emma cornered me in the kitchen. Dan, please, she begged. I know I've hurt you. I know I've ruined everything. But can't we try to fix this? For them? I turned to face her, my expression hard. You don't get to use them as an excuse, Emma. You didn't think about them when you were sneaking around with Tom, so don't pretend they're your priority now. She flinched, her hands twisting nervously. I'll do anything, she said desperately. Counseling, therapy, whatever it takes. Just give me another chance. I stared at her, feeling a flicker of something I couldn't quite identify, pity, maybe, or exhaustion. It's too late, I said finally. You can't unring a bell, Emma. The trust is gone, and without that, there's nothing left to fix. Her face crumpled, and she sank into a chair, sobbing quietly. I watched her for a moment, then turned and walked away. That was the last real conversation we had. After that, everything became about logistics, splitting assets, finalizing the divorce, figuring out custody arrangements. Whatever we'd had, whatever we'd been, was over. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of relief. Not happiness, just relief. A small, bitter victory in a war I never wanted to fight. The weeks following that last conversation were a blur of paperwork, tense silences, and a household that felt less like a home and more like a battlefield divided into neutral zones. Emma and I communicated only when necessary, and even then, our words were clipped and deliberate, devoid of emotion. The house that had once echoed with laughter and life was now eerily quiet, the atmosphere heavy with resentment and unspoken regrets. The kids stayed with me most of the time. Jason barely spoke to his mother, retreating into his room whenever she came around. Lily, on the other hand, clung to Emma during her visits, desperate to hold on to the family she thought we still were. Watching them navigate the fallout of our decisions was like swallowing broken glass, but there was no way around it. Divorce is ugly. It's a dismantling of every promise, every dream, every illusion of permanence you ever held on to. But it's also practical, a series of legal steps and financial decisions that strip away the emotion and reduce your shared life to a list of assets and liabilities. By the time we reached the final hearing, I felt numb. The lawyers talked about percentages and custody schedules like they were negotiating a business deal. Emma sat across from me, her face pale but composed. I couldn't tell if she was relieved or devastated. The judge granted us joint custody, though the kids would stay primarily with me. Emma agreed to sell the house, and we'd split the proceeds evenly. It was a clean break, at least on paper. But emotionally? There was nothing clean about it. When it was over, Emma lingered outside the courthouse, waiting for me as I signed the final documents with my attorney. I considered walking past her, pretending not to see her, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the look in her eyes, tired, worn, almost pleading. Dan, she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the hum of traffic. I stopped, my hands in my pockets, and waited for her to continue. I wanted to say I'm sorry, she said, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. For everything. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know that I never meant for it to end like this. I nodded, my expression unreadable. I know you didn't, I said. But intentions don't change what happened, Emma. What's done is done. Her lip trembled, and for a moment, I thought she might break down right there on the courthouse steps. But she held it together, nodding slowly. Do you think we'll ever? I mean, will it ever get easier? She asked. It has to, I said simply. For the kids, if nothing else. She bit her lip, her gaze dropping to the ground. Take care of them, Dan, she said softly. They need you more than they need me. I didn't argue. She wasn't wrong. We stood there for a few moments longer, the weight of everything unspoken hanging between us, before she turned and walked away. I watched her go, feeling a strange mixture of relief and sadness. It was the last time I saw her in person for a while. Life after the divorce wasn't easy, but it was simpler in some ways. The kids and I settled into a routine, finding small moments of joy amidst the chaos. Jason started opening up to me more, though his relationship with Emma remained strained. Lily struggled the most, but with time and therapy, she began to find her footing. As for me, I threw myself into rebuilding. Not just financially, but emotionally. I reconnected with old friends, took up running again, and started attending a support group for divorced dads. It wasn't about wallowing in self-pity, it was about understanding that I wasn't alone, that other people had been through the same storm and come out the other side. Every now and then, I'd get an update on Emma. She moved into an apartment across town, started seeing a therapist, and seemed to be trying to put her life back together. We communicated occasionally about the kids, but it was always brief and to the point. Whatever love we'd shared was gone, replaced by a kind of mutual respect born from necessity. One evening, months after the divorce was finalized, Jason came into my office holding an old photo album. He set it on my desk and flipped it open to a picture of all of us at the beach, back when he was just a little boy. Do you miss it? He asked, his voice hesitant. I looked at the photo, at the smiling faces frozen in time, and thought about his question. I miss what it felt like back then, I said honestly. But sometimes, Jason, the things we miss weren't as perfect as we remember them. And that's okay. It's part of moving forward. He nodded, his brow furrowed in thought, and then closed the album. Thanks, Dad, he said before heading back to his room. As I sat there alone, staring at that old photograph, I realized that he was right to ask. I did miss parts of it, the laughter, the shared dreams, the way things used to feel before they fell apart. But I didn't miss the lies, the betrayal, or the constant second-guessing. I was finally free of that weight, and for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to start living again. Not as part of a broken marriage, but as myself. The road ahead wasn't easy, but it was mine to walk. And that, at least, was something worth holding on to.